This is the ZMF Atrium, a biodynamic driver headphone from ZMF that I was loaned a demo unit of to review, but I loved it so much that I had to buy a pair for myself. It's a headphone that I'm not entirely sure how to review because this defies my expectations of what I'm usually looking for in a headphone. And yet, in the last few months, this has been the headphone that spent the most time on my head out of everything that I have. So let me tell you why. The Atrium is delivered not in a cardboard box, but in a Pelican-style case, which does an excellent job of protecting them, and is just the first aspect that makes these feel like a truly boutique item. As to the build of the headphones, well, that's one of the main reasons why you buy a ZMF headphone. These look absolutely stunning, and they are incredibly comfortable as well. The weight of the headphone is going to depend on which one you get. You can get these in a variety of different woods, including some gorgeous stabilized and resin options, which do cost more and may weigh more, but I think the aesthetics are well worth it. And these are very comfy, including for longer listening sessions. The headband does a really nice job of distributing the weight over your head, not just having it in hot spots. And you can actually adjust the headband, not just in height with these rods here, but you can bend the headband itself to fit your head shape better and adjust the amount of clamp that you want. So that way you've not got all of the weight just pushing down on the top of your head, but you haven't got the pads squeezing in on either side of you. And you can actually opt to change some of the metal parts for magnesium to further reduce weight. There's a selection of extra pads that you can get to go with your Atrium and swap the pads to change sound a little bit. Pad rolling is something which ZMF headphones are pretty well known for, and the Atrium is no different. This review though, I'm using exclusively the stock pads for two reasons. Firstly, that's what most people are going to get, but secondly, of all the pads that I tried, those ones on the Atrium sounded the best. On the ZMF Verite Closed, for example, the pad rolling was more of a game of trade-offs. It was just a change, and I couldn't really quite decide which pads I liked most on those headphones. But the Atrium, all the other pads I tried did something to the treble that I just didn't quite get on with, but the stock pads were fine. So I went back to the stock pads. Those are the ones that I thought sounded the best. That's what this review is going to be using. The pads aren't the only thing that you can do to change sound on the Atrium though. You can also change the mesh, which provides some damping for the driver. There's three options. You've got no mesh if you want, you've got a solid mesh, which provides the most damping, and a vented mesh, which is somewhere in the middle. I personally didn't like having no mesh because it made the treble a little bit peaky sounding, so that wasn't particularly great. With solid mesh though, that was actually what I liked if I'm listening to electronic music. It makes the headphones sound tighter and more controlled at the expense of cutting short decay of acoustic elements a little bit too early. So if I was on an electronic music kick, I would swap to the solid mesh, but for general purpose listening, and if I'm going acoustic or classical, the vented mesh was the one that I'm using. The aesthetics of the Atrium are quite frankly stunning, and as mentioned, a big part of why many people want ZMF headphones. Handcrafted from various woods in raw and stabilized versions with some resin variants available too, a selection of materials to pick from for the grills which are designed in the style of a church or cathedral rose window and give it a both elegant and very distinct aesthetic. The included cable I think is fine. It's a twisted and sleeved cable and has a quite nice conical splitter, though it does have a fair bit of shape memory and it would have been nice to see it be a bit softer. The cable that you'll spot throughout the B-roll in this video, by the way, was made by my friend Skedra, aka Viking Weave Cables. The one-off matched resin connectors that he did for this particular Atrium are a one-time thing. He unfortunately doesn't do those normally, but if you do want a gorgeous custom cable for your favorite headphones, there is a link to his website in the description. This isn't sponsored, he's just a friend of mine, he does great work, and so I wanted to shout him out. Also, I didn't want people to think that that was the stock cable that came with the Atrium. Unfortunately, it isn't. When it comes to the sound of the Atrium, the first thing to mention is that these are not the kind of headphone that you'll want to go for if your primary goal is to maximize detail retrieval and raw technical performance. These are not a particularly resolving headphone. They're not a particularly realistic sounding headphone. They're quite colored in presentation, but whilst usually that would limit a headphone for me personally to being something that I use now and then when the mood or the particular track that I'm listening to calls for it, as I mentioned earlier, these have been the headphones that have spent the most time on my head out of everything that I have for months now. And the reason why is simply that these have a tuning and performance profile that so perfectly rides the line between being able to resolve and show off the well-produced elements in music, whilst not making flaws in mixes and production distractingly apparent. These are a headphone that I can throw absolutely anything on and be completely confident that it is going to sound great, which is not something that I can say about most headphones. I use the HiFiMan Susvara as my benchmark headphone for most stuff, and by that I mean when I'm judging source gear or I'm listening to a track which I know has been produced well, and I want to extract every last ounce of detail and spatial information and separate everything and really get immersed when the source material itself is not limiting anything. The Susvara is the closest headphone that I have to a window into what has been recorded. But on the flip side of that, the Susvara is a very technically capable and neutral sounding headphone, which means if that track has been mastered in a way where you might want some more intimate and forward vocals, it's not going to give you that. If you want a slightly more punchy or exaggerated low end, it's not going to give you that. And if there are any flaws or imperfections in the mix, it's going to make them painfully obvious, which can be quite immersion ruining. It can pull you out of things and make you wish that they weren't quite so up front and center. But the Atrium has this ability to extract and show off the good things in tracks, but make the flaws and imperfections less apparent. And it's doing this not through just having an ideal level of detail retrieval or something, but it's almost like the individual performance aspects are almost selectively good at certain things in a manner that just works really well. In terms of driving requirements, these are 300 ohm and 96 dB per milliwatt, so not particularly hard to drive. You don't need anything crazy for these, and you can run them on most portable stuff as well. What I would say is that when pairing an amplifier with these headphones, look for something that has either a slightly warmer profile inherently or something with higher output impedance. For something more neutral, the Hollow Audio Bliss in high Z mode was really good. For something a little bit more colored and sort of romantic sounding, the Woo R23 was an excellent sounding tube amp with these headphones. Amps that I otherwise really adore, like the Ferrum Ore for example, didn't work quite as well with these. It still sounded great, but it wasn't up to par with the other two, I think because it's very neutral and the output impedance is extremely low. And actually, these headphones do like an amp with slightly higher output impedance. So if you're looking for something a little bit more affordable, the Syncsa SA1 with the high impedance mode enabled, that would be a good choice too. Let's start with the bass. These are a biodynamic driver headphone, and biodynamic drivers are stereotypically known for being quite punchy and impactful sounding. That's absolutely the case here. These are a very hard-hitting headphone with pretty great sub-bass extension too. These are a dynamic driver, so it's not flat. There is a slight sub-bass roll-off past 40 Hz or so, and exactly how much will depend on which pads you're using. But it was absolutely subtle enough that I didn't find myself wanting for more, and the overall bass profile on these is quite prominent but very well controlled, and it gives you this deep-reaching and encompassing sort of sound. Listening to Childhood by Closey on these is one of my favorite reproductions of that track. The bass profile on the Atrium does have the expected dynamic driver slightly curved shape to it, and it reaches a maximum around 80 to 100 Hz, which likely helps with that feeling of impact. In fact, some manufacturers have actually started trying to replicate that deliberately in planar headphones that wouldn't otherwise have it. The DCA Expanse, for example, that's a good one. They actually put some passive filter components, capacitors and resistors, to deliberately add a hump around 100 Hz to make it sound more impactful. And so the Atrium gives us a very forceful and present but controlled sounding low end. It avoids the trap of being too mid-bass focused and falling into the muddy territory that a lot of lesser headphones can fall into. K means clustering, which, by the way, that whole album has exceptional production. That's a track which shows off how the Atrium can provide not just that leading edge impact, but the weight of the following body of the element as well. It doesn't just hit and then die away because it can't sustain that kind of force and rumble. And it's also not that it's weighty but pillowy sounding because that initial leading edge wasn't defined enough. It does both. There's a lot of headphones which sound fast and snappy but not weighty or bassy enough. And then there's a lot of headphones which are sometimes very bassy but not snappy enough to actually hit you around the back of the head. These can hit you around the back of the head hard enough to forget some stuff. The mid-range on the Atrium is slightly forward compared to neutral, and most likely just due to the fact that it's got that slight sub-bass roll-off and a slightly dark overall treble. But if you just look at the frequency response, it looks fairly neutral there overall. And it is. It's not a super colored headphone in terms of the tonality in that aspect. But what is interesting and what is quite different from what I'd consider transparent, but is also one of the main reasons I like this headphone so much, is everything sounds really textured on the Atrium. It's like, even though a particular voice might not be pushed forward in the mix a ton, it's not that the voice itself is more prominent. Everything that makes up the timbre and character of that voice is pushed forward in relation to what note that voice is actually singing or what note that instrument is actually playing. It's actually kind of easiest to describe this visually. This is what I'd say a high-performance neutral headphone like a Headphone Aria might sound like. It's clear, detailed, and relatively true to life. And then this is what it looks like through the Atrium. The texture of stuff is more apparent. The surface and detail of it isn't actually any more prominent, it's not brighter, it doesn't have any more information there. It's just altering things in a way that makes you pay less attention to the thing itself and more to the parts that make it up. This is a really weird psychoacoustic effect that I would love to know more about what's causing it, because there are no other headphones that I can think of that do it in quite the same way that these are doing it, and I'm into it. I've seen quite a few people describing the Atrium as having a good timbre without any further elaboration, and personally I disagree with that, simply because good timbre or accurate timbre doesn't mean something sounds good or bad. It means it has accurate timbre. It means if you're playing a reproduction of an instrument through that headphone and you had that instrument in front of you, the character of that instrument would be identical. That's what accurate timbre means, and that's not what these do, but that's exactly why I like them so much. If I wanted accurate timbre, I would go for a Headphone Susvara, but I listened to these a lot more than my Susvara over the last few months, because these change and exaggerate timbre in a way which I really, really like. That texture-forward alteration makes things sound more visceral and tactile than they otherwise would, and it's an addictingly engaging effect. These headphones are, as mentioned, a little bit on the warmer side, and many warmer-sounding headphones tend to suffer from a drawback of being a bit more congested than their more neutral or leaner sounding counterparts, often not either straight up staging as big, or if they do, not being quite so precise in terms of where they're placing things. The upper treble, the airy aspects often aren't handled quite as well. Not an issue on the Atrium. The Atrium stage not only very wide, frontally excellently as well. The soundstage shape is a quite nice, even oval sort of presentation, but also they can present the variation in distance, the layering of things from you, excellently as well. Cracker Island by Gorillaz has the main vocals right inside your head. There's no limitation to the minimum distance that these can present. Some larger staging headphones have a bit of an effect where everything is a bit too diffuse, and so Sennheiser HD800, for example, that's a very big sounding headphone, but it can't do things in close all that well. These, they've got the main vocals right inside your head, the percussion a little distance off, and then the other vocals and the synths even further off again. Nothing overlaps. The difference in distance is very precisely defined. Imaging or precision of direction is a little bit less standout. It's not bad by any means, and it absolutely avoids the 3 blob effect that certain poorer headphones can fall into, but it's just not necessarily anything to write home about either. The level of imaging accuracy that these have, though, actually plays a little bit into what I was saying earlier about not making flaws in mixes super apparent. Certain tracks can have better or worse defined imaging or movement of certain elements, and this can hide when that's not done so well, whilst still being able to separate the direction of different things enough that in busy mixes you don't have trouble focusing on any one particular element. Overall, the spatial presentation on the Atrium is very good. They have a little bit of a dark treble profile generally speaking, but have a little bit more upper treble air above 10 kHz or so than many other headphones. So they sound open, they've got that ability to layer complex mixes effectively, and that also helps with bass content as well, because not only can it hit with that clean leading edge helped by that incisive treble, but it can also then keep its control and definition sustained for the trailing body of that element. So what exactly are the drawbacks of this headphone? Well, the first is simply that this is not a neutral headphone. The ZMF Atrium are a warmer and more visceral sounding headphone than neutral, and so for someone looking for something reference or for mixing stuff on, these aren't going to be ideal. But the second thing is simply that these are not on the same level in terms of detail retrieval as other headphones, including some a fair bit below this price point. A Headphone Aria, for instance, quite comfortably outresolves these, but what's really surprised me is that for a long time, detail retrieval was one of my top priorities. All of the other headphones that I have are very detailed headphones. And what surprised me on these is how much I didn't care about the resolution, when this is doing such a good job of shifting my attention away from that and onto other elements like how textured things are, the bass control, and not just shifting my attention away, but doing those better than other headphones. This is still a fairly resolving headphone, it's just that you wouldn't buy it for that. And the way that it focuses your attention on the texture of vocals in particular is unlike anything else, and the giggle factor engagement when you've got something viscerally loaded with bass is just top notch. It pulls you in, but it is still articulate, resolving, and open enough to handle the strings, the airiness in an orchestral recording, for instance, without any overdone intimacy or congestion. So these are quite a flavored headphone. These are not a neutral headphone, and for that reason alone, a lot of people are unfortunately immediately going to discount it as an option. But for me, whilst if I'm wanting to immerse myself in the very best of recordings, to extract every last ounce of detail and separate everything and listen to the intricacies of the environment in which something was recorded, I would go for something like a Susvara. But the question of what do I want more often, that sheer technical performance and transparency and neutrality, or this altered but quite stylistically curated change to the sound, isn't even a question which I really answered intentionally. I answered it kind of subconsciously by simply reaching for these to put these on much more often than any other headphone I have. And as a reviewer who's got quite a few high performance headphones to choose from, I think that's the best possible compliment that I could give a headphone. This is the headphone that I plain and simple wanted to listen to and enjoyed listening to the most. I hope you enjoyed that review. If you wanted to come and ask me any questions about the ZMF Atrium or anything else relating to gear, music, or anything else for that matter, head over to my Discord server and I and other Wiggly Air enthusiasts will endeavour to help. Or if you're feeling supportive, head over to Patreon. You can support me there and you get access to the private supporters only Telegram chat. It's also getting to that chilly time of year, so if you want a comfy hoodie, you can do that in the link in the description. Thank you very much to my crazy Summit Fi supporters Dan Mellinger, Jithan the Shiba, and Joe, and my Diamond tier supporters Naivotsu, Neil Snyder, Eminent One, Jamari Henry, and Speliofu.